Hi, friends. Welcome back to our series on Christian Zionism. Here in this episode, I have a conversation with Brooke Baker. Brooke is a PhD candidate in Islamic Studies at UCLA. Her research focuses on Christian-Muslim relations, Islam in the West, and also discursive trends, that is, shifts and movements and trends in the discourse, in the language surrounding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and especially as they relate to the narrative and identity of Christian Zionism itself. Her research focuses on the shifts she is noticing in the political activism of Christian Zionism. So I couldn't think of someone better than Brooke to help us unpack what has been happening among Christian Zionists in the last few years, especially through CUFI, Christians United for Israel, the biggest really Christian Zionist group and organization in the US that boasts about having more than 10 million members, and a very influential group in American politics and also in many church spaces and so on. Our conversation deals with these shifts that Brooke notices in the way that Christian Zionism today manifests itself, and also its efforts, especially by CUFI, to reach out to new communities, especially Blacks, Latinos, and others, and especially to influence how millennials and younger generations think about Israel. A very important conversation, especially for us who are thinking actively, hopefully, to find better ways to engage, respond to, and critique Christian Zionism. And for those who support us on Patreon, we discuss also the influence or lack thereof, maybe, of Christian Zionism on the American political support for the war in Gaza, and how much Christian Zionists play a role in the way the U.S. has been uncritically supporting Israel on its genocidal war on Gaza. Very interesting conversation there as well. If you would like to listen to that conversation and watch my conversation with Brooke there, consider becoming a supporter and to support the work that we are doing here at Across the Divide. Anyway, without further ado, here's my conversation with Brooke Baker. Welcome, Brooke, to Across the Divide.
Thank you for having me.
So in this series we're doing on Christian Zionism, we hosted some conversations, especially with Daniel Hamo and Stephen Sizer, that helped us understand the political power of Christian Zionism. So by the way, audience, if you haven't listened to those conversations, make sure to do that before listening to this conversation, because in many ways, our conversation here is going to follow those conversations as well. But basically, they helped us understand the political power of Christian Zionism, not just as a theological movement, but also as a political, activistic, and very involved politically movement. So I thought it would be fantastic to bring you as a scholar who's researching and works on Christian Zionism, and especially on these what you call discursive shifts that happened in Christian Zionism recently as they adapt to changing dynamics theologically and politically and otherwise. So I think this is great to have you here, and really appreciate you being with us.
Yeah, excited to be here.
So Brooke, then the first question that I have for you now is why are you interested in Christian Zionism? Tell us more about your background and how you got interested in this research topic.
Sure. Yeah. So my interest in Christian Zionism goes back pretty far. Actually to high school. So I developed an interest in Islam in high school, which is a different story for a different time. But in my conversations with Muslims, the topic of Palestine kept coming up. I realized that this is a sticking point for a lot of Christian-Muslim dialogue for a lot of reasons. But when I was having these conversations, this was kind of in the early wake of 9/11. And, this was a time when Americans generally had this idea that Muslims, writ large, didn't like Christians, and this had something to do with some sort of primordial conflict between Christians and Muslims, but also that, they hate us because we're free. There was really no sort of popular discourse or understanding of US imperialism or any sort of geopolitical factors that might have contributed to, conflict between the West and the Middle East. So it was interesting that Palestine became such a central sticking point within these conversations. And I think it just presented for a lot of Muslims this very clear case of like American kind of blindness toward injustices happening in the Middle East, and biases towards Muslims that have these really real world impacts. And I attended like a Southern Baptist church growing up that was kind of implicitly Christian Zionist. I don't remember any sort of like explicit, like, dispensationalist discussions or, discussions around, supporting Israel. But there was always just this kind of unspoken understanding that Israel was congruent in some way with like the ancient Israelites, and that they were made up of God's chosen people, and that, you had to support them. And I actually ended up going to a Southern Baptist university as well. And the summer after my freshman year, I took my first trip to Israel and Palestine for a biblical studies tour for just a couple of weeks. And I will never forget, we get on the bus first day there, and we have an Israeli tour guide who comes on, and she is introducing us to the country, and she says, and if you see anything backward, that's because we're in the Middle East. And that just always stuck with me, because I was like,
Yikes.
kind of paying attention for, any discussion of Palestinians. And that was one of the first things I heard. And to my professor's credit, this was a Southern Baptist institution, but both biblical studies professors who went on this tour with us were like not Christian Zionists. They actually recommended Gary Burge's Whose Land, Whose Promise to all of the students. And this kind of started for me personally, like a theological engagement with Christian Zionism. And then I wrote my senior thesis for my undergraduate program on Christian Zionism, kind of looking at it through a theological lens. And now I'm a PhD student at UCLA. I do Islamic Studies, but I do focus on Christian Zionism. So still kind of broadly Christian-Muslim relations, but kind of as it relates to discursive shifts within Christian communities, especially in the mid-20th century, around like Christian Zionism, mainline Protestant Christian Zionism, though today I'll talk a little bit more about like evangelical contemporary Christian Zionist discourse.
But you're not doing Islam right now. You're focusing solely on Christian Zionism, right?
Yeah, I've kind of migrated a little bit to Christian Zionism specifically, but a lot of the discourse that I'm looking at has implications for Christian-Muslim relations, and I'm also looking at like representations of Muslims in Christian Zionist discourse. So tangentially, it's within the realm of Islamic studies.
Yeah, okay, I see that. Yeah. I mean, this is an interesting conversation. Like, since the war broke out on October 7, us as Palestinian Christians, we have wonderful friends and allies in the West, obviously, and they're honestly they're so helpful and so encouraging for us. But on the flip side, you see also this shift that is happening in how we think about our connection to Western Christianity, where we see a lot of support and solidarity and empathy with Muslims globally. And we're seeing a lot of antagonism and support for the war from our siblings in the faith, Christians in the West. So it creates this very awkward kind of place for us as Palestinian Christians. We're like, wait, you're in the family with us. Like, why are you doing this to us? But then we feel so much affinity and solidarity with Muslims and Arabs around the world, which is super interesting and also unsettling for us as Christians in Palestine, especially, and also in the Middle East, and now especially in Lebanon. Anyway, that's really cool. And also, you've been to Palestine recently, right? In 2022.
Yes, yeah. So I was there for about a month in 2022. Spent some time in Jerusalem, and then most of the time kind of throughout the West Bank, and like had a great opportunity to do a geopolitical tour of the West Bank, which gave me kind of a visual understanding of things that I had studied virtually. And so we visited Nablus as well, which I had learned a lot about through my sister, who actually spent a year there teaching English. So yeah, so I've had a good bit of personal kind of connection to Palestine through friends and family, but but unfortunately, it's so challenging to travel there. I'm trying to go there for research, but have hit like several hurdles kind of in making that happen. But yeah, I'm grateful for the time I have been able to spend there.
Yeah, no, Nablus is the biblical Samaria. So there's a Jacob's well there, and you have the Samaritans who still live in Nablus. A very cool place. Many Christians avoid, mostly because of the power of Christian Zionist tourism in Palestine, Israel, where a very important site in Christian and Jewish history is actually ignored just because it's all Palestinians and it's mostly Muslims, even though there's a beautiful Christian community in that town. Anyway, so let's jump to the main topic of our conversation here. Jump into the conversation I want to have with you about the political power and activism of Christian Zionism. But before that, like, I'm curious about any observations you have about kind of shifts in trends or action or theological movements. I think so. Stephen Sizer emphasized dispensationalism as the driving force for Christian Zionism, which is kind of this obsession with the end times and the apocalyptic visions. Dan Hummel, which I think you're influenced by, is emphasizing more of the Genesis 12:3 version or emphases, which is on prosperity, the prosperity idea of if we support Israel, we will be blessed, which seems to have, right now, it has a lot of, I think, power and attraction among many Christians, including in the global South, in Africa and Latin America and so on. So yeah, out of curiosity, like, how do you see any kind of shift or development in the 20th century, and then how kind of that moved in the 21st century?
Yeah, so there's a lot to go into here. I'm not sure how much detail I should start with, but I mean, Stephen Sizer is absolutely right that dispensationalism is fundamental to the Christian Zionist movement because, in large part, it helps kind of catalyze the Christian Zionist movement. And just briefly, for the listeners who aren't familiar with it, dispensationalism arose in the 19th century by John Nelson Darby, who was not necessarily a Christian Zionist, but he was trying to create a new hermeneutic for understanding the Bible. He basically says that the history of humanity can be divided into 7 dispensations or time periods, and that Jesus arrived in the 5th dispensation, and that the church age is the 6th. But this means that there is yet to be a 7th dispensation. So this kind of engenders a literal futurist hermeneutic, whereas prophecy hasn't always been applied to future context. Sometimes it's been applied to the present context or past context, but this really helped catalyze like a futurist literalist reading of scripture, and also places Israel quite centrally in this futurist hermeneutic, because dispensationalism separates the church and the covenant with the church and the covenant with the children of Abraham, so the Israelites, the Jewish people. So that means that both of those covenants are ongoing and continue to have a role to play. So that's kind of where we get this idea of like a series of events at the end times, starting with the return of Jews to their ancient homeland, the rebuilding of the temple, the eventually the rapture of true believers, a period of trials and tribulations, the coming of the Antichrist who poses the Messiah, and then you have the real second coming of Christ, and then you have this millennium, this literal 1,000-year reign. So all dispensationalists are premillennialists in that sense. So this is fundamental to Christian Zionism, but not as fundamental as some scholars have made it out to be. And I think this is where a lot of the work of like Daniel Hummel and others has become very useful in recognizing that, for most of the 20th century, fundamentalists were not the primary proponents of Christian Zionism. So for the first half of the 20th century, it was actually mainline Protestants, like liberal Protestants, who were the primary kind of lobbyists for Christian Zionism in the United States. And these groups purportedly supported Israel on the basis of, or supported the idea of a Jewish state even before 1948, on the basis of like political pragmatism, humanitarian concerns, and democratic ideals. Now, what my future research is looking at is kind of between the lines, like, are these really kind of the fundamental concerns for mainline Protestants? Because I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that prophecy and some vague sort of eschatological expectation is still very much in play even though they were very much like embarrassed about dispensationalism and apocalypticism. There's still some sort of like teleological understanding of like, oh, Israel is going to play a role in some sort of end time scenario. But
sure.
You do have, I think dispensationalism definitely leaves its mark on the Christian Zionist movement in kind of all of its forms. But as Daniel Hummel mentions, in the 80s especially, you have this major shift toward what he calls spirit-centered Zionism. So it's an emphasis on Genesis 12:3, which it's where God tells Abraham, like, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and all of the peoples of the world who will be who bless you will be blessed. Basically, I'm not quoting this directly, but this basically creates this binary of blessings and cursings depending on your level of support, both material or kind of ideological support for the state of Israel. This is how it's interpreted under spirit-centered Zionism, that this support has to be absolute because there's only two sides of this binary. There's really there's not a lot of nuance that can be interpreted from this verse. So even though dispensationalism did kind of operate in this Orientalist framework with a major understanding of a dichotomy between an East and West, good and evil, Judeo-Christianity versus Islam, you actually see that reified under the Genesis 12:3 narrative because of this binary between blessings and curses. So I would say, dispensationalism has definitely been a major part of Christian Zionism. Genesis 12:3 becomes ultimately the operating kind of MO of Christian Zionism, especially with the founding of CUFI in 2006. So Christians United for Israel, as you know, is like the primary Christian Zionist organization. It claims over 11 million members worldwide, although I do think that's inflated. As far as I can see, they count their membership by people who have subscribed to their mailing lists, which by that measure, I'm a member because I have subscribed to it for research purposes. But
Sure.
But regardless, it's a large number. So plenty of studies have indicated that most evangelicals in the United States have Christian Zionist beliefs in one way or another. There are 50 million evangelicals in the United States. And so that's a huge block. So if you think there's only about between 15 and 16 million Jews in the entire world, and then you have 50 million evangelicals in the United States, the weight of Christian Zionists is like clearly very significant. So this organization is involved in lobbying and all kinds of propaganda efforts. The television networks supported by the organization that runs CUFI have like 150 different TV stations across the world. There's all kinds of online publications. There's a TV show, The Watchmen, that has historically been well viewed, talks a lot about dispensationalist kind of apocalyptic oriented beliefs. But as I mentioned, a lot of these have been changing in recent years. So
I'm here because you mentioned Muslims and Jews, and I'm kind of interested to before we kind of dig deep in what CUFI is doing. Robert Smith in the first episode of the series talked about the Reformation and how I think he calls it like apocalyptic or anxieties about people around them. It's like what to do with the Muslims, what to do with the Turks, what to do with the Jews. And then quickly that developed into this kind of attitude of essentializing them and comparing and contrasting between themselves as Protestants, between them and Catholics and Muslims and Jews and so on. So I'm curious we didn't unpack that a whole lot. You do some work on Islamic studies as well. So I'm kind of interested, like how did Christian Zionism portray or think about Jews and Muslims within kind of the movement they had?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I have used CUFI as a case study for kind of all the reasons I mentioned. They are in a lot of ways representative of the Christian Zionist movement. It's certainly the largest Christian Zionist organization. It has a lot of power, and is at this point pretty well integrated into like Israeli Hezbollah, and has a lot of connections to the Israeli government. So so I'm using Kufi specifically.
What's Hezbollah, Brooke?
Yeah, Hezbollah is just the kind of propaganda wing of the Israeli government. And it's pretty well established.
Foreign relations, public relations.
Yeah, public relations. And kind of narrative making, like official state narrative making. So so it's quite interesting. So Muslims and Jews, prior to the shift that I'm studying, and by the way, the shift that I'm focusing on occurs kind of starting in 2010. So it's still within the Genesis 12:3, like spirit-centered Zionist era, but in a lot of ways, it begins to disrupt the binary of good versus bad, east versus west, whatever. So briefly, I'll kind of talk about prior to this 2010 shift. So I assume that most of your listeners are familiar with Edward Said's Orientalism. This is like somewhat canonical now. Just this, Edward Said wrote about this pervasive understanding in the West of a dichotomy between East and West, generally understood to be made up of a Muslim civilization on the one hand versus a Judeo-Christian civilization on the other, and that this is pretty ubiquitous throughout American and Western European imaginations of themselves and of the other, and that this has had a major impact on Western historiography, but also on like foreign relations, on geopolitics, basically. So I would characterize kind of 2010 Kufi and pretty much all of Christian Zionist discourse as highly Orientalist. So first I'll kind of go into the dispensationalist futurist hermeneutic camp. So there are a couple of themes that were really common. So dispensationalism, as I mentioned earlier, engendered this futurist reading of biblical prophecy, which allowed for the reinterpretation of biblical passages and their applications to present and future contexts, sometimes applying them to cases in which like the original context was not clearly prophetic. So one example that's very common in Christian Zionist context is drawing upon Isaac and Ishmael. So Isaac is the one who is understood to have received the promises of God, whereas Ishmael, traditionally understood as like the progenitor of the Arabs, according to like early tradition, is applied to like everything in the Hebrew Bible that refers to Ishmael is kind of applied to the modern context, applied to Arabs. So it says that in the Hebrew Bible that Ishmael was against everyone and everyone was against him, that he was wild and untamed, a donkey. And, this is applied as like a prophetic, like, oh, look, this applies to Arabs, the Palestinians, that they're somehow animalistic or intractable or inherently violent. Similarly, we see this with like David and Goliath in the book of Samuel. So David being an Israelite versus Goliath, a Philistine being kind of tied to contemporary Palestinians. And then basically the entire book of Revelation is applied to the modern context, and signs are looked for to see how this could fit to with Islam or with Palestine. Like there's speculation that the Antichrist is the Mahdi in the Islamic context. In spirit-centered Zionism, it may seem that the emphasis on blessings and miracles is more innocuous than the prophetic-centered language of kind of dispensationalism. But as I mentioned before, the dichotomy of Genesis 12:3 actually heightens and reifies this idea of a nefarious East associated with Islam and a beneficent West associated with Judeo-Christianity. So, for example, you have curses for not fully siding with Israel. This places Palestinians ultimately as being at odds with God, which is pretty severe. John Hagee famously said that, another 9/11 could happen if God is provoked, basically by Americans not supporting Israel. Blessings, on the other hand, are also, the Genesis 12:3 is quite ambiguous when it says blessings and curses. So this command to bless Israel leads a lot of Christian Zionists to offer unequivocal support for the nation state, regardless of its policies, and to the belief that all of the biblical land, including that which makes up the West Bank and Gaza, should not be compromised under any circumstances, because that might risk, the wrath, like the curses of that dual blessing curse dynamic. So there's a lot that we could kind of go into here. CUFI has also given, this is before 2010, CUFI spent a lot of time giving a platform to like former Muslims who had converted to Christianity, who purportedly were revealing the true nature of Islam. So Walid Shoebat was one example of this. He claimed that, real Muslims are practicing taqiyya, or concealment of their true beliefs or intentions, when characterizing Islam as peaceful or compatible with Western values of liberty, religious freedom, and justice. That Westerners who believed that Muslims were peaceful were drinking the Kool-Aid. Both Hagee and Shoebat have said that like Islam's goal is world domination, like period, and that the first step in fulfilling Muhammad's dream, this was what Hagee said, would be the destruction of the state of Israel. So this is kind of pre-2010. At the same time, pre-2010, you have Jews being portrayed in a very essentialist way as well. So in the same way that Muslims were racialized and essentialized in the service of fitting neatly on this one side of this Genesis 12:3 binary, so too have been Jews. So Christian Zionist discourse was historically focused on European Jews, or Ashkenazim. And language around an East-West binary was given a central place in Spirit-centered Zionism specifically, thus reifying Ashkenazi identity and experience and contributing to the inclusion of Sephardim and Mizrahim, so Jews who were not of European descent. You also have a good deal of, and this has mitigated a little bit post 2010, but still was I would say heightened before this. A lot of philo-Semitism and fetishization of Jews. So again, because Genesis 12:3 is unqualified, there's an expectation that these promises are everlasting and unequivocal. So therefore, like, your love of the Jewish people and your support for the Jewish people should be the same. So this leads to like an idealization of Jewish people, which might seem like a good thing, but it's actually quite dehumanizing. It's a form of othering, and often actually leads to resentment. So if you believe that there's this group who is inherently like chosen and special, then this has led to resentment among a lot of Christians, which can ironically lead to anti-Semitism itself. And then you have all kinds of fetishization. So especially with kind of the merge of Christian Zionism and Pentecostalism and the prosperity gospel as well, you have the tokenization of Jews, where Jews can be used as like totems to garner blessings. And then even the appropriation of Jewish practices. So practicing Passover or different holidays or traditions in a way that is not necessarily welcomed by like Jewish communities. And then finally, I would say, while Christian Zionism might seem like this like wholly beneficial thing for Israelis, it's actually had a pretty negative impact on the peace process, including left-leaning Israelis who have been trying to advocate for peace. So, in 1977, there was a major shift in Israeli politics known as the Great Upset. It was basically when Menachem Begin was elected as prime minister. He kind of initiated this right-wing turn in Israeli politics away from like labor Zionism. And this coincided with the right-wing turn in Christian Zionism in the United States. And ever since then, there's been kind of a really strong like political alliance between the Israeli right and the Christian Zionist right, or the American right. And a part of that has meant that like American Christian Zionists have reinforced the right-wing Israeli push to like not compromise land for peace. Because on the Christian Zionist side, you have the idea that any sort of compromise is violating the Genesis 12:3 kind of dichotomy, that is not blessing Israel in the way that, you know, you're supposed to unequivocally bless Israel. You have instances of Christian Zionists now attempting to rebuild the temple, aiding the Temple Mount Faithful, which is a fringe Israeli group that's been trying to rebuild the temple in Israel and Jerusalem. So there have been active efforts to like breed red heifers, for example. I believe in Texas they've actually successfully done this. So so there are now like red heifers that can be sacrificed, like along the lines of like temple sacrifices that are outlined in the Hebrew Bible. You have like searches for the Ark of the Covenant. People have begun collecting like temple materials, things that are built to scale as they would be able to be used for temple sacrifices and practices. And this is obviously quite controversial for a number of reasons, but the major reason is because it would require the destruction of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. So this is far from beneficial to like Israeli or like Jewish peace in especially among left-leaning Israelis who have always been very critical of these moves. And you also have major support among Christian Zionists for illegal settlements. So between 2000 and 2010, more than half of the settlements in the West Bank received more than $200 million in funding from Christian Zionist organizations. And a really large number of Christian Zionists, about 67%, support settlements in the West Bank, which is double that of other religious groups. So this 12-3 shift was actually quite detrimental to the peace process, but also even to the Christian Zionist movement. It's actually an escalation from the dispensationalist kind of precursors.
Friends, if you're enjoying this episode and want to support Across the Divide, consider supporting the work we're doing here through our Patreon page at patreon.com/acrossthedivide. By becoming a monthly supporter, you'll gain access to unpublished content and other exclusive benefits. Again, the link is patreon.com/acrossthedivide. Thank you, and back to the episode.
I just have a few thoughts, and just there's so much there. So I just want to give you a break maybe, and I just kind of share some thoughts with you as well, just for the audience to give them more context about some of the stuff that you mentioned. You mentioned two Palestinians. I should just kind of spend more time on them. I mean, they're kind of interesting. One of them more than the other. So the first one is Edward Said. He's one of the Palestinians that we really love. He was a Palestinian Christian from Jerusalem. And he wrote, like you said, the book Orientalism, I think published in 1978. A really important book, seminal book. Just do not buy it. It's not that enjoyable. It's not an easy read, but it's a very important book that has really had a huge and oversized impact on Western scholarship towards the Middle East and towards Muslims. It critiqued the very reductionist ways and just really awful and racist ways that many people in the West have viewed Muslims and Arabs. And since then, it has basically challenged the academy in the West to think better about Muslims and the Arab world, to see the diversity, the beauty, the complexity, the philosophy, the theology of that region, kind of move away from those essentialist binaries. Of course, that had an impact on the academy, but not necessarily on the everyday average person who doesn't really know about Edward Said. Edward Said passed away in 2003, but look him up, SAID, Edward Said, basically. There are a lot of videos of him speaking. Every time he speaks, he's just brilliant. The other Palestinian, which we do not look him up, Walid Shabat, he's actually from my hometown, from Bethlehem, which is embarrassing. But he was a Muslim, became a fundamentalist evangelical, converted. And he was basically one of those talking heads, just bashing Muslims and bashing, saying awful things about Muslims and terrorism and so on. And he was at some point like employed by the State Department, or he was leading training for government officials as well, and how they think about Muslims and terrorism. I don't know if he's active anymore. I haven't seen anything from him in a very long time. But anyway, I thought that would give some context for the audience. But also I think, Brooke, for me, like what you were saying about how Christian Zionism views Muslims and Jews, whether it's in the harmful, reductionist, negative way towards Muslims, or in the tokenized, what we call philo-Semitism, this obsession with Jewish people and Jewish culture, both of them are not based on love, right? Like, to use that Christian language, like you're not respecting and caring for people and loving them and when I get to know them and share life with them, you're just using them, right? Like you're just creating some kind of stereotype about them. And it's not grounded in any appreciation of culture or about encounters or about listening or engaging. It's mostly a very, just maybe, I don't know if I want to use the word colonial, just this kind of, this supremacist attitudes towards them. Like Muslims are bad, Jews are great, we love them, we're going to use them this way, we're going to do what they, do these things for them. And I think you're right in pointing out like how problematic both positions are. A scholar in Christian Zionism once said, this is in a talk that he gave and I was there, and he said he cannot think of any formulation of Christian Zionism that is actually ethical, that actually has a good attitude towards other people. And also you pointed out, Brooke, the issue about peace. Like Christian Zionists have a huge impact on the peace process in the Middle East, about Palestine, Israel, the two-state solution, the settlements, and actually they are the ones who are in many ways like delaying any kind of resolution. And of course, the Israeli government, if it sees that, hey, Christian Zionists are giving us money for the settlements, we're going to double down on the settlements. And the philo-Semitic Christians who love Jewish people, well, in that case, we're going to keep doing what we're doing because we know these people can never criticize us. And that's the thing, right? Like Christian Zionism, as from what you're saying, is antithetical to justice, antithetical to peace, and really antithetical to both Jews and Muslims. So I would concur. There's no formulation, at least it seems to me as well, of Christian Zionism where it's actually a force for good and for peace and for justice for both people.
No, I mean, absolutely. I do think there are certain strains of Christian Zionism that are trying to be a little bit more nuanced and, critical of Israel. Although it's you mentioned the book at one point, The New Christian Zionism by, I believe, Gerald McDermott. And I think it's trying to kind of revive this like mainline Protestant, progressive Christian Zionism. It harkens back to like Reinhold Niebuhr and some of the mid-20th century kind of liberal theologians who were advocates for Israel. But there's a lot to say on that, and it's outside of the scope of this conversation. But I think that it's clear that I will say, like, I do think it's clear that in a lot of those strains, the fundamental motivation is theological and implicitly eschatological, and you just can't be genuinely focused on ethics, as many of these groups claim, when that is your foundational motivation, because you're going to, at the end of the day, like make your argument work for the state of Israel, regardless of what it does. So anyway, but yeah, I digress.
Okay, so no, this is really good. Yeah, this is very helpful. So Brooke, so I interrupted you as you were trying to get us into the shift that happened in 2010, and I'm super eager to know what happened in 2010. So yeah, what kind of just got to continue the conversation? Like, what do you see in the shifts that Christian Zionism had towards, I think you're trying to speak about also Jews and Muslims, but also maybe generally you can tell us about kind of this shift and what kind of characteristics, like what is that kind of shift known for? Like what happened actually?
Yeah. So within the context of CUFI, we see in 2014, so a little after the 2010 shift that I'll talk about in a second, we start to see some programming initiatives that are quite divergent from their previous MO. So in 2014, CUFI launches a diversity outreach program. It says it's targeted primarily toward young people, especially students on college campuses. And the executive director at the time, David Bragg, talked about this initiative saying, and I'm going to quote here, "Israel is multicultural, multiracial, diverse, and tolerant. This truth is the most powerful antidote to the apartheid lie. We're devoted to aggressively disseminating this truth to everyone. Thus, we've assembled a team as diverse as Israel itself. We're targeting everyone, but placing a special emphasis on millennials because they are being aggressively targeted with the anti-Israel lies. And we're also very purposeful about reaching out to African Americans and Hispanics since they are also being targeted with this Israel settler Europeans myth." So he's kind of, he's giving the raison d'etre of this diversity outreach program on the outset. But it's actually quite fascinating to see what the content of this program includes, because it is, remember, I listed all of those ways in which Muslims were demonized, Jews were essentialized, the Middle East versus the West is like pretty central to kind of the worldview of this organization. To lead this diversity team, so this is a good example, just to lead this diversity team, the organization hired a man named Qasim Hafiz. He is a British-born Pakistani self-proclaimed Muslim Zionist, which I think is remarkable considering everything they have said about Islam in this organization prior to this point. So for years, they've made every effort to portray Muslims as inherently untrustworthy, violent, and evil, and now Muslims being given this like highly visible platform. I think it's also worth noting that in 2020, Qasim Hafiz tweeted something that made it seem that he had actually converted to Christianity, but this was not highlighted anywhere within the CUFI promotional materials. Like they did not highlight this at all, which is fascinating because they had always previously given a major platform to like Muslim converts to Christianity. So there seems to be some sort of utility to having people think that he was Muslim, right? They have Qasim Hafiz. You can actually watch this show on YouTube. He leads a weekly like television program called CUFI Weekly, and it could not be more different from The Watchmen, which was one of CUFI's earlier like television series. It uses very careful and nuanced language of Muslims in the Middle East. It actually uses the word Palestinian, which up until that point, CUFI had been pretty insistent about not acknowledging the legitimacy of Palestinian identity, even refusing to use the word Palestinian in favor of Arab or other like more derogatory terms. And it even talks about Palestinians' concerns, although ultimately in the service of supporting Israel, right? At one point, they refer to themselves and Israel as the most pro-Palestinian people in the world, ultimately blaming all of the problems that Palestinians face on Hamas, which, as we know, is pretty consistent with Israeli Hezbollah. The diversity outreach coordinator that is hired for this project is a man named Dumasani Washington. He's an African-American pastor, a longtime Christian Zionist who authored the book Zionism and the Black Church. And he also founded the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. Throughout his book, he focuses on social justice. He talks a lot about the plight of the Palestinians. He's actually quite sympathetic toward Muslims. Ultimately, he blames the plight of Palestinians on Arab states. And I think it's clear, like this is also a very strategic hire. So he meets the diversity kind of values of, younger evangelicals specifically. He also is uniquely positioned to challenge the accusations of like civil and human rights abuses in Israel. yeah, he also appeals a lot to Martin Luther King Jr. And other like Black American leaders, kind of like in some way tying them to support for Israel, which is fascinating. You also have, let's see, in 2016, CUFI establishes about 160 CUFI on campus chapters. So basically, they are like community organizations with also a lot of like promotional material about Israel. And all of their material is is sympathetic toward Palestinians, and even includes some Muslim voices who are like, these are like token Muslim voices who are opposed to BDS, for example. In 2022, you have at the major annual CUFI conference, you have the ambassador of the Kingdom of Bahrain to the US speak to the audience, and is talking about like like children of Abraham coming together to forge a path forward of mutual respect. He talks about the virtues of Islam and how there are all these common values with Judaism and Christianity. This is the largest and most visible of CUFI events, and they are giving this platform to this Muslim who is kind of extolling the virtues of Islam. Absolutely 360 from portrayals of Muslims kind of 10 years prior. Then on the Jewish side of things, the major difference, so remember you have this essentialized, racialized view of Jews as being Western, often white, a focus on Ashkenazi experience of the Holocaust, European pogroms. You have this kind of appeal to the Judeo-Christian civilization. Now, there is a project that was launched, I don't remember when this was launched, just a few years ago, called the Mizrahi Project. And for those who don't know, Mizrahim are Israeli Jews of Middle Eastern descent. Most Mizrahim do not identify as Arab Jews, but that's partly a political, there's kind of a political history for that, reason for that. Some do continue to identify as Arab Jews. If you're interested in this topic, Ella Shohat is a Mizrahi author and scholar, and she does a really great job kind of explaining a lot of the history of Mizrahim in Israel. But CUFI introduces this Mizrahi project to highlight the diversity of the Jewish population, as well as kind of trying to put a lens on like social justice and taking the focus away from Palestinians toward Mizrahim. So they describe Mizrahim as the forgotten refugees, referring to the nearly 1 million Middle Eastern Jews who were evicted from their homes across the Middle East and North Africa. And, according to CUFI, they were welcomed by Israel with open arms, that Israel used its law of return to kind of save these Middle Eastern Jews from what they describe as like a Middle Eastern Holocaust. But I think it's important to note that this depiction of Israel's early policies toward the Jews of the Middle East eclipses a lot of really important historical realities. So while Israeli lawmakers did apply the law of return to Middle Eastern Jews, they did so only reluctantly. A lot of the Zionist officials were wary of mass immigrations of Levantines, this was their word, Levantines, into the new state, but allowed their entry due to demographic and economic necessity, and to avoid total political collapse. So they were ultimately seen as a potential cheap labor force that could replace the Palestinians who had been recently exiled. So CUFI doesn't include any of this history. They kind of describe Yemeni and Iraqi immigrations as like these rescue missions where Israel, kind of sacrificially brings these people to the state and gives them everything they need to kind of fit into this like this utopian Jewish community. But what's missing from the narrative is the ways in which Yemeni and Iraqi immigrants were treated upon arrival to their new home. So Yemeni immigrants in particular were shorn of their side locks. Religious artifacts were stolen by Zionist emissaries with the false promise of return. Infamously, babies were kidnapped because it was believed that these Mizrahi Jews were not like capable of giving them the best lives in this new state. So they were kidnapped and given to Ashkenazi families. And there's also no mention of the ways in which Mizrahim were forced to assimilate to Ashkenazi religious norms, having no choice but to send their children to Ashkenazi Orthodox schools, where they would learn the correct ways of practicing Judaism, and thus lose Jewish traditions that were unique to their countries of origin. Same thing in their descriptions of the Farhud, or so like the expulsion of Iraqi Jews from Iraq in the early 1950s. Kufi kind of portrays the Iraqi Muslims as barbaric, as, you know, Muslim mobs who destroyed and looted Jewish homes and businesses and killed, beaten, raped thousands of Jews without the authorities intervening. So that's how they describe this. Reality. So in the 40s, you have the emergence of like Zionism, which was an Ashkenazi, like European nationalist project. And a lot of the Iraqi Jews at this time were actually like vehemently anti-Zionist and were pretty committed to staying in an area that they at this point considered home. They spoke, you know, Judeo-Arabic. They spoke a particular form of Iraqi Arabic, considered themselves a part of the Arabo-Islamic culture. So the events of the Farhud were actually exploited and distorted by Zionist groups in an effort to Zionize Iraqi Jews and encourage immigration to Israel. So there's evidence of Zionist activities in Iraq aimed at creating bad blood between Jews and Muslims. So, for example, there were instances in which Zionist actors placed bombs in synagogues to incite fear and panic and to spur the Iraqi Jewish community towards Zionism and ultimately moving to Israel. There's also a lot of evidence of double entry bookkeeping. So basically, the Iraqi government did freeze the assets of Jewish migrants who left Iraq to go to the new, Jewish nation state. But in order to avoid paying reparations to Palestinian refugees, the Israeli government basically instituted a program of double entry bookkeeping so that the loss of Iraqi Jewish assets could be used as leverage to avoid paying those reparations to Palestinian refugees. So there's so much that can be said about this as well. I don't want to get too bogged down into the history of Mizrahim in Israel, but I think it goes to say this Mizrahi project is very much in line with kind of contemporary Israeli Hasbara. It's really fascinating that they are no longer trying to ignore Muslims or the Middle East, or trying to uphold this binary between East and West, but are actually trying to disrupt it to a certain degree to show how diverse the Jewish population of Israel is, and even be much more sympathetic toward Islam and Muslims and Palestinians generally.
Yeah, there's a lot there that is so interesting, especially about the Mizrahim, the Eastern Jews, and what happened in Iraq and Egypt. Of course, there's a tragedy, and honestly, it's a big loss for the Middle East that we lost so many of these beautiful Jewish communities in Yemen, Iraq, Egypt, Morocco, and so on. We still have some of them, I think, in Morocco or so on, or maybe in Yemen as well, but huge loss. But also you can see how propaganda and hateful speech and racism played a role, and then in basically kicking them out, forcing them out, and convincing them that Zionism is going to save them. But also today, the Israeli government continues to be a very European government, a very Ashkenazi government, and a lot of discrimination against non-European Jews in Israel. But so you're saying that there's this kind of Kufi and others presumably were trying to be more inclusive and also speak the language of millennials and work with minorities, right? So so you were trying to say what the causes of that shift, and what are the main causes you're identifying there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. of potential causes. So, the Black Lives Matter movement was highly influential in kind of popularizing post-colonial or anti-colonial discourse. You also have the Trump presidency in 2016 that galvanized a lot of centrist or left-leaning Christians and evangelicals. But this shift happens a little bit earlier than that. So I think personally that based on when this shift occurred and some of CUFI's own comments related to these programs, the two major factors were Palestinian Christian activism and shifts among younger evangelicals. The second one is obviously much more broad, but I'll start with the first one. So obviously, as you know, Palestinian Christian intellectuals have been involved in, Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism since their emergence. Palestinian nationalism is unique in that it included this kind of shared experience of resistance against Zionist-inspired colonialism. So it's a particularly strong form of nationalism. And Christians have always been pretty central to that. The kind of Palestinian Christian Zionists that are kind of platformed by CUFI are quite marginal and not at all representative of the wider population. So Naim Atik is a fundamental name here. So he is the founder of Palestinian liberation theology. So he writes his book, Justice and Only Justice, in 1989. He kind of draws from other liberation theologies, which are post-colonial, anti-colonial by nature, in kind of articulating a specifically Palestinian theology of liberation. And this becomes highly influential as well as his organization, Seville, the Seville Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center in Jerusalem, which establishes chapters all over the world. So Friends of Seville chapters can be found everywhere. And I think it's hard to overemphasize how significant this was in, introducing a lot of Western Christians to the plight of Palestinians, to the existence of Palestinian Christians. And I do think Palestinian Christians are incredibly important in discussions around Christian Zionism because they disrupt this perceived binary between East and West, Islam and Christianity, because they kind of they don't fit really neatly within the binary, the Orientalist binary that is so embedded into a lot of our subconsciouses. In kind of the early 2000s, you start to see a lot of traction in Western contexts when it comes to sympathy or just awareness of Palestinian causes. 2010, I think, is a turning point because you see kind of an explosion in the production of films and materials and conferences for Christians who are supportive of Palestine. So you have two major films that are released in 2010. You have With God on Our Side, which took particular aim at CUFI, and it was endorsed by several prominent evangelicals. And then you have the film Little Town of Bethlehem, which reads the Palestinian struggle through the lens of civil rights era America. So targeted specifically to Americans and helping them to see this through kind of a lens that they're familiar with. You also have the first Christ at the Checkpoint conference, which obviously of at Bethlehem Bible College and in the West Bank. And the first year, it had a few prominent evangelicals, but it was really the second year into 2012 that attracted more than 600 attendees, including a sizable contingency from Wheaton College, which is one of the most prominent evangelical institutions in the United States. After attending the Christ at the Checkpoint conference, the publisher of Relevant magazine completely reversed its stance on Israel. You had Lynn Hybels, who started promoting alternative alternative tours of the Holy Land that included sites in the West Bank and Palestinian Christian narratives, you really start to see this kind of like a waterfall, basically, of Western evangelical support for Palestine and kind of criticism of Christian Zionist narratives. And then in 2015, you can already see some of popular opinion changing. So there was a poll in 2015 that showed that 40% of U.S. evangelical leaders had changed their thinking about Israel and Palestine over the past 15 years, with the change being a greater awareness of the struggles faced by Palestinian people. So the second major thing that definitely has changed in this time period was changes among younger evangelicals. So, evangelicals' emphasis on a literal reading of the Bible helped contribute to the rise and spread of Christian Zionism, no doubt. And there still is a strong correlation between evangelicalism and Christian Zionism in the US today. Evangelicals hold considerable political weight, so they make up over a fourth of all Americans and more than a third of registered voters. Roughly half of American evangelicals are politically conservative, and 30 to 40% are centrists or moderates, so pretty far right on the scale. And as a general rule, those further on the right tend to support Israel over Palestine. But we're starting to see some major shifts among younger evangelicals. So fundamentally, when it comes to moral authority, you have a greater emphasis on personal conscience over like kind of the Bible as the major source of ethical reasoning. So a Pew Research study in 2014 showed that only 39% of evangelicals under the age of 30 believed that Holy Scripture is the Word of God and should be taken literally, compared with 64% of those who are 65 and older. So this seems to have a clear correlation for support for Israel, as this demographic was also less likely to believe that the modern day Israel is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, or that God has a special relationship with Israel. Similarly, a 2021 study conducted by researchers at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke noted that on sources of evangelical support for Israel, younger evangelicals were pulling away from Christian Zionism pretty strongly. Age is actually the number one determining factor for evangelical support for Israel now in the United States. And notably, it was not because younger evangelicals were less religious. It was actually the opposite was the case. So, and that was based on frequency of reading the Bible and church attendance. However, younger evangelicals had shifted pretty significantly to the left. So ideological and political changes have occurred pretty rapidly, and they have major implications for the future of evangelical support for Israel. And David Brogg, the former CUFI executive director, was aware of this, and he wrote in 2014 that these changing attitudes were something that they should ignore at their peril. So I think pretty clearly this is the major reason why they're kind of incorporating some of these diversity outreach initiatives.
Brooke, we're coming to an end of our time here. I kind of want to talk with you more about the implications of this shift.
Yeah.
But we might have to save that for our Patreon supporters.
Sure.
So stick around with me. But I want to ask you about, we focused heavily on CUFI, but there are different or other organizations as well, like Passages, which takes Christians on these brainwashing, honestly, trips to Israel. And there's also the Philos Project, which was also brought up in our series as well as one of those Christian Zionist organizations. And there are many more. I think CUFI obviously is the biggest one. Do you, just as we wrap up, do you see also this is happening in these organizations? And also, are they also losing kind of their footing as well with this kind of shift that is happening theologically and politically in the US?
I do think it's happening more widely. I think a part of it too has to do with taking cues from Israeli Hezbollah. I think that they are working more closely with the Israeli state and the kind of narrative making and making sure that those narratives are congruous. So yes, I do see it elsewhere as well. I think that the implications are pretty severe. Like, first, I don't know how deep this shift actually
Okay,
goes.
let's talk about them. That's fine.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it remains. There was I think in 2017, there was a poll that showed that like 4 out of 5, like 80% of American evangelicals do believe that the modern state of Israel was like a fulfillment of prophecy, and kind of indicative of the end time. So 80% of 50 million is still 40 million people. That's 2017. That's pretty recent. So, that's after this discursive shift. Is that actually representative of what the average Christian Zionist believes? I don't know. I think that like dispensationalism and apocalypticism have been unpopular, like in the media, and like easy targets for people who are critical of Christian Zionism. And so they're partly just changing the PR strategy. So yeah, it's unclear how deep this shift actually goes. And then also thinking of social identity theory, the disruption of this binary between us and them, good and bad, East and West, like this Orientalist dichotomy, is, I think, undercutting the movement, because I do think it's that like epic binary, this dichotomy with epic proportions, that gives Christian Zionism so much of its like appeal to so many Americans who are invested in this like grand narrative, this meta narrative of, this epic fight to the end times. So yeah, so if this is a permanent shift, I think it's got some significant implications. I don't unfortunately think that it is representative of like the wider streams of Christian Zionism. I do think, kind of hearkening back to what Daniel Hummel mentioned in his earlier recording of your podcast, I think that the future of Christian Zionism kind of rests on the globalization of Christian Zionism. And I think there are two major directions that could go. It could go toward, this Pentecostal Genesis 12:3, like blessings and curses route, or it could go toward the liberation theology route, which already, began in the global South, already has a pretty wide global reach, and appeals to a lot of people in formerly colonized or, economically colonized contexts. So I just think that remains to be seen on what's actually going to be the fate of Christian Zionism.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Brooke, this is really good. It's super detailed and helpful, and I think it fills a lot of the gaps, or kind of where we stopped with Dan, with Hummel, and others. So this is really good. At the same time, maybe we can finish with a hopeful note here from you. It's also depressing to know how much, obviously, how strategic they are, Christian Zionists and Kufa and so on, but also how well-funded, and they can do these things because they're well-funded. You brought up us Palestinian Christians as kind of playing a role in kind of this shift that is happening. That's very generous of you. So I do not feel, obviously it was maybe because of the war, I just don't feel very encouraged about shifts that is happening. And obviously because they have so much power and money and resources, then, this could feel like a hard battle against Christian Zionism. Mm-hmm. So on a hopeful note, from your kind of historical ideological analyses, like how do you see, like how, for those of us who are maybe committed to fighting against Christian Zionism, like how can we move forward, in a hopeful way, perhaps, against this kind of tide of this so much power of Christian Zionism? So
I think that the basic power of any movement comes from the basic beliefs of the people who support it. And I think most people who support Christian Zionism do so not because they understand the intricacies of the movement or the theology or dispensationalism or whatever. It's because they have some sort of impression about a narrative that they fit into, and that Israel fits into, or that the Middle East fits into. And I feel hopeful because I really do think that meta narrative that is so deeply tied to, Western imperialism, to Orientalist structures, that I think that meta narrative is changing. I think that's changing partly because of the work of so many anti-colonial and post-colonial thinkers throughout the global South who are now having much more of a voice. And I think people are pretty widely starting to recognize that a lot of what they've been taught about history and about like the West's place in it is somewhat skewed. And so as that meta narrative starts to break down, I really do think that people will start recognizing that like Christian Zionism is a part of it, and that they might start thinking about the Middle East differently. That's what gives me hope.
Yeah, no, and it's good to have, and we're seeing some cracks. We're seeing that shift happening, and I think your point about millennials is actually true, because both of us are millennials, and also Gen Zs are interesting right now. I don't know if we have how much data we have about Gen Zs, but there's something that is happening, and I guess it's important to be hopeful that change would happen and freedom and justice would happen as well. Okay, Brooke, well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for the work you're doing and just awesome research you're doing here, and very thoughtful. Appreciate the work and the time you've put into this. So yeah, thank you, Brooke.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Bannoura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abir Shhali. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.